Here is a question that almost nobody thinks to ask. Alcohol is one of the oldest and most widespread substances in human history. Every civilization on Earth, across thousands of years, developed some version of it. It appears in ancient religious texts, in trade routes, in medicine cabinets, in ceremonies, in the cultural traditions of virtually every society that has ever existed. And yet, nobody invented it. The process that creates alcohol was already happening in nature, completely without human input, long before the first human ever walked the earth. The real question, the genuinely interesting one, is how the humans who found it figured out what it was, what to do with it, and eventually, how to make more of it on purpose. And the answer involves overripe fruit, wild yeast, animal behavior, and one of the most consequential accidents in human history. So let us go back, all the way back. Before breweries, before wineries, before amphoras and barrels and glass bottles. Back to a time when the discovery was made, not in a controlled setting, but on the ground, in the open air, beside a pile of fruit that had been sitting in the sun just a little too long. Subscribe to Freud Mind, and let us get into the story of how humans discovered alcohol. To understand the discovery, you first need to understand the process. Fermentation, the natural chemical reaction that produces alcohol, does not require human involvement, specialized equipment, or any understanding of chemistry. It requires only three things: sugar, yeast, and time. Yeast is a microscopic fungus that exists almost everywhere in the natural world. In the air, on the surface of fruit, in soil, floating on the wind. When yeast comes into contact with sugar in a moist environment, it begins to consume it. As it does, it produces two byproducts: carbon dioxide, which creates the bubbling or fizzing you associate with fermentation, and ethanol, which is the specific type of alcohol found in fermented drinks. This process happens automatically, without instruction, without oversight, without any understanding of what is occurring. It simply happens, whenever the right conditions exist. Overripe fruit is an almost perfect fermentation environment. The skin of a piece of fruit, when it begins to break down, creates an opening through which wild yeast can enter and begin consuming the sugars inside. In warm conditions, this process moves quickly. A fig dropped from a tree, a bunch of grapes fallen and split on the ground, a pile of dates left in the sun. Within days, these can become significantly fermented. The fruit changes, the smell changes. The liquid inside becomes something different from what it was. And for any creature that ate this fruit, the experience of eating it would be noticeably different from eating fresh fruit. This is where the story gets interesting, because humans were not the only animals who encountered naturally fermented fruit, and the way various animals respond to it gives us a useful window into what the early human experience might have looked like. There are documented observations of animals consuming naturally fermented fruit in the wild, though it is worth being honest that many of the most dramatic accounts circulating online have been significantly exaggerated. Elephants in Africa have been observed seeking out fermented fruit from the marula tree, and the debate about whether they consume enough to produce genuine intoxication has been ongoing in the scientific community for decades. Vervet monkeys on the Caribbean island of St. Kitts, descendants of monkeys that were introduced during the colonial period, have been observed consuming fermented sugarcane and alcoholic beverages left unattended by tourists, with behavioral responses that researchers have found genuinely interesting. Various bird species have been documented exhibiting unusual behavior after eating fermented berries. Certain species of tree shrews consume large quantities of naturally fermented palm nectar as a regular part of their diet without apparent ill effect, because they have evolved specific metabolic adaptations for processing it. What all of these observations suggest is that naturally fermented fruit and plant matter has been part of the ecological landscape for an enormous amount of time, long enough for some species to develop specific metabolic responses to it, and long enough that the encounter between animals and fermented plant matter is not unusual or rare. It is a feature of natural environments wherever sugar-containing plants exist, and wild yeast is present, which is essentially everywhere. Ancient humans, navigating environments full of fallen and overripe fruit, would have encountered this regularly. The fermented fruit would have looked different, smelled different, tasted different from fresh fruit. And eating enough of it would have produced a noticeably different physiological experience. The warmth, the slight disorientation, the loosening of inhibition that comes from even moderate amounts of ethanol. For someone who had never experienced this before and had no framework for understanding what was happening, it would have been genuinely strange, possibly alarming, and, for at least some people, probably interesting enough to prompt further investigation. The archaeological evidence for early human alcohol consumption is older than most people expect, and it keeps getting pushed back as new evidence is discovered. The oldest confirmed chemical evidence of an alcoholic beverage currently known to researchers comes from a site in China's Henan province, where pottery fragments dating to approximately 9,000 years ago were found to contain residue consistent with a fermented drink made from rice, honey, hawthorn fruit, and grapes. This was not a single-ingredient drink but a sophisticated blend, suggesting that whoever was making it had significant experience with the fermentation process and was deliberately combining ingredients to produce a desired result. 9,000 years ago, before most of the things we associate with civilization. But the consumption of naturally occurring fermented substances almost certainly predates the intentional production of fermented drinks by an enormous margin. Researchers studying the evolution of alcohol metabolism in primates have found that the genetic mutation allowing efficient processing of ethanol, a mutation in the ADH4 gene that dramatically increases the body's ability to metabolize alcohol, occurred in the common ancestor of humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas approximately 10 million years ago. The leading hypothesis for why this mutation emerged and was retained through natural selection is that it provided an advantage in processing fermented fruit that fell from trees and was encountered on the forest floor. In other words, the human body's ability to handle alcohol may have been developing for 10 million years before the first human ever intentionally brewed anything. The moment of intentional discovery is impossible to pinpoint precisely, but the logic of how it might have happened is not difficult to reconstruct. Imagine a group of ancient humans who had encountered fermented fruit on multiple occasions and noticed the consistent pattern. Certain fruit, left for a certain amount of time, produced a specific and distinctive effect when consumed. They did not understand yeast. They did not understand fermentation chemistry, but they did not need to. They only needed to observe the pattern and recognize that it could be replicated. The fruit that had been sitting in the warm sun for several days produced the effect. The fresh fruit did not. The pattern is simple enough to observe without any scientific framework. The step from observing this pattern to attempting to reproduce it, to intentionally leaving fruit to sit, or storing it in a container, or selecting the fruit that had already begun to change, is not a large conceptual leap. It is the same kind of pattern recognition and intentional replication that underlies almost all early human technology. You notice that a certain type of rock produces a sharper edge. You go looking for that type of rock. You notice that certain fruit, in certain conditions, produces a certain effect. You attempt to recreate those conditions. What happened next, over thousands of years, across multiple civilizations, was a gradual accumulation of knowledge about what ingredients could ferment, under what conditions, and how the results could be improved, controlled, and varied. Different groups working with different ingredients in different parts of the world arrived at different results, independently and through parallel processes of observation and experimentation. The first fermented drinks humans produced intentionally were almost certainly based on whatever ingredients were most abundantly available in the local environment. And this is where the story becomes genuinely interesting from a cultural and historical perspective, because the diversity of early fermented drinks reflects the diversity of the environments in which they were developed. Mead, fermented honey and water, is one of the oldest fermented drinks in the archaeological record, found across an enormous range of cultures and geographic regions. Honey is a remarkably good fermentation substrate. It is high in sugar, widely available in environments with flowering plants and bee populations, and requires only water and time to begin fermenting. The word for mead or honey wine appears independently in the linguistic roots of ancient Greek, Sanskrit, Old English, Russian, Welsh, and several other language families. A distribution so wide that linguists believe it suggests the drink predates the separation of these languages from their common ancestor. Mead may be older than any of the civilizations that have left written records. Beer from grain appears in the archaeological record of ancient Mesopotamia, the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that is often called the cradle of civilization. With evidence going back to at least 5,000 years ago, and possibly considerably further, some researchers have made the provocative argument that the desire to produce beer may have been one of the motivating factors behind the early cultivation of grain in this region. That the agricultural revolution, which transformed human civilization, was partly driven by the desire to produce a reliable supply of fermented grain. This argument remains debated and is not the mainstream position in archaeology, but it is taken seriously enough by researchers to be the subject of ongoing investigation. The idea that beer may have helped encourage early farming communities to cultivate grains more consistently is an active area of research rather than a settled conclusion. Wine from grapes appears in the archaeological record of the ancient Near East and Mediterranean, with the oldest confirmed wine residues found in Georgia, in the South Caucasus, not the American state, dating to approximately 8,000 years ago. Grapes are one of the most productive fermentation ingredients in nature. The wild yeast that exists on grape skins makes grape juice particularly prone to fermenting quickly and thoroughly. The ancient civilizations of Greece, Rome, and the broader Mediterranean world developed elaborate traditions around wine production and consumption that shaped culture, religion, and trade across an enormous geographic area for thousands of years. In East Asia, rice became the primary fermentation ingredient, producing what is now the oldest tradition of rice wine in the world. The fermentation of rice requires a slightly different process from grape or grain fermentation. It involves a mold called koji that converts the starches in rice to sugars before yeast can convert those sugars to alcohol. And the fact that this more complex process was independently developed in East Asia is a testament to the depth and sophistication of early brewing knowledge. The uses to which early civilizations put their fermented drinks were considerably more diverse than simply recreational consumption. And understanding this diversity is important for understanding how significant these drinks were in the ancient world. Religious and ceremonial use was prominent across virtually every early civilization that produced fermented drinks. In ancient Mesopotamia, beer was used in religious offerings and was associated with specific gods. In ancient Egypt, wine and beer appear in ritual contexts throughout the historical record. In ancient Greece, wine was central to the worship of Dionysus and featured in religious ceremonies, philosophical symposia, and cultural rituals. In the pre-Columbian cultures of the Americas, chicha, a fermented maize drink, was used in religious ceremonies and as an offering to the divine. The consistent appearance of fermented drinks in religious contexts across cultures that had no contact with each other suggests something deep about the human response to the altered state these drinks produce, a sense that it was connected to something beyond ordinary experience. Medicinal use was also widespread. Ancient Egyptian medical texts describe wine and beer as ingredients in medicinal preparations. Hippocrates, the ancient Greek physician whose name is associated with the foundational ethics of Western medicine, described wine as useful in treating fever, as a wound wash, and as a vehicle for other medicinal substances. Ancient Chinese medical texts describe fermented drinks in similar contexts. The antibiotic properties of alcohol, its ability to inhibit bacterial growth, made fermented drinks genuinely useful as wound treatments and as a means of preserving medicinal ingredients in solution before the development of other preservation methods. The question of fermented drinks as an alternative to contaminated water is one that is frequently simplified in popular history. In certain historical contexts, particularly in densely populated ancient cities where water sources were easily contaminated, the fermentation and boiling processes involved in producing beer and wine may have made these drinks safer than untreated water from certain sources. But this was not universally true, was not the primary reason fermented drinks were produced, and should not be taken to mean that ancient people were drinking beer instead of water as a general rule. Clean water sources were used and valued. The spread of brewing knowledge across the ancient world followed the spread of trade, travel, and cultural contact. Merchants carrying goods between civilizations also carried information about ingredients, processes, and the products that different regions had developed. The spread of viticulture, grape growing and wine production, from its origins in the South Caucasus across the Mediterranean world, is one of the best documented examples of how brewing knowledge traveled, carried by Phoenician traders, Greek colonists, and Roman expansion across thousands of years. The Romans, in particular, were enthusiastic about spreading viticulture to the regions they conquered. When Roman legions moved into Gaul, modern France, they brought vine cultivation with them, establishing the foundations of what would eventually become one of the world's most sophisticated wine traditions. When they moved into Britain and Germany, they brought wine culture, though the climate of those regions was less suited to grape cultivation, and local brewing traditions using grain and other ingredients remained dominant. Every civilization that encountered a new fermented drink did not simply adopt it unchanged. They adapted it, modified it, combined it with local traditions, and developed new variations suited to local ingredients and preferences. This process of cross-cultural exchange and local adaptation is how the enormous diversity of fermented drinks that exists today came to exist. Not through any single inventor or originating culture, but through thousands of years of human curiosity, experimentation, and exchange. One of the more remarkable aspects of fermentation science is how little the fundamental process has changed over thousands of years, even as the technology surrounding it has become dramatically more sophisticated. The wild yeast that ancient humans stumbled upon doing its work on fallen fruit is the same organism, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, that commercial brewers and winemakers use today, in carefully cultivated and selected strains that have been developed and maintained over generations. Some breweries and vineyards maintain yeast cultures that have been kept alive and active for decades or longer, representing a direct biological link to fermentation traditions that stretch back centuries. The basic chemistry is identical to what was happening on the forest floor 10 million years ago, when the ancestors of humans first encountered fermented fruit. Yeast consumes sugar. It produces alcohol and carbon dioxide. The only things that have changed are the containers, the controls, the precision of measurement, the scale of production, and the depth of understanding of what is actually occurring at the molecular level. The fundamental reaction, the one that started everything, is as old as the relationship between yeast and fruit, and considerably older than humanity. Today, every country on Earth has its own fermented or distilled drink tradition, often multiple traditions, often with regional variations, often tied to specific cultural, seasonal, or ceremonial contexts. Japanese sake and shochu, Korean makgeolli and soju, Ethiopian teji, Russian kvass and kefir, Mexican pulque from agave, Ethiopian tej from honey, Belgian lambic beer fermented by wild airborne yeast in a tradition that deliberately echoes the original process of natural fermentation. German Reinheitsgebot, the purity law for beer that dates to 1516 and remains the oldest food quality regulation still in use anywhere in the world. Bourbon from American corn, Scotch from malted barley, rum from sugarcane, cognac from French grapes. The diversity of these traditions is a testament to the universality of the underlying discovery, that wherever sugar, yeast, and time come together, fermentation happens, and to the remarkable creativity with which human cultures have explored and developed the results of that basic natural process. Some people enjoy these traditions as a social and cultural experience. Others avoid them for personal reasons, for health reasons, for religious reasons, or by preference. Both are completely reasonable positions, and the history of alcohol is full of both enthusiastic adoption and principled rejection across different cultures and time periods. What is consistent across all of these different approaches is that the substance itself, its nature, its origin, and its place in human history is genuinely fascinating regardless of one's personal relationship with it. The thing that makes the origin story of alcohol particularly interesting is that it is not really a story about human ingenuity in the traditional sense. It is a story about human curiosity, about the willingness to investigate something strange rather than simply avoid it, to ask why something is happening rather than just accepting that it does, and to attempt to recreate and understand a natural process that was happening around them long before they arrived. The fermentation of overripe fruit was not a problem that needed solving. It was not a gap in human knowledge that someone set out to fill. It was simply something that was happening in the world, in the warm air, on fallen fruit, in the natural interaction between yeast and sugar, and some human, at some point, paid attention to it, noticed what it produced, and decided that the result was worth understanding better. That impulse, the curiosity that says this is interesting, let me look more closely, is the same impulse that underlies every significant human discovery. The specific trigger was overripe fruit on the ground. The result was one of the longest-running and most widespread traditions in human history. The next time you walk past overripe fruit lying in the sun, the burst skin, the changed smell, the particular look of something that has moved past ripe into something else entirely, remember that you are looking at the same natural process that sparked one of humanity's oldest discoveries. The yeast is doing exactly what it has always done. The only difference is that now we know what to call it. Subscribe to Freud Mind for more.